Is nobody giving the Georgia Bulldogs a chance in Tuscaloosa? What will it take for the Dogs to eat up Kalen DeBoer's offense? Locked On SEC starts right now.
You are Locked On SEC, your daily podcast on the Southeastern Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And what's happening, everybody? Welcome into Locked On SEC. It's great to have you guys along on today's show. We'll get you some SEC tidbits, and we'll get you set for the Alabama-Georgia game. We did the Alabama side of things yesterday with Ryan Fowler. Today, Graham Coffey gives us the Georgia side of things, and we get a fair and balanced perspective on this monster game. I'm Chris Gordy. Thanks for making Locked On SEC your first listen to every day. Shout out to everydayers. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. And of course, we're on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, all the places you can find your podcast. Today's episode is also presented to you by our friends over at FanDuel. They got some great things going on over at FanDuel right now. Place your first $5 bet and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com today to get started. All right, let's dive into it. We got plenty to discuss. Let's go around the conference.
Boots out to the right. Intercepted. Takes the handoff. What a catch.
Around the conference.
And of course, this monster game between Georgia and Alabama in Tuscaloosa. We're hearing from both sides. And let's start with Alabama football running backs coach Robert Gillespie. He knows what it takes to face Georgia. He says it's a physical matchup. This is a physical league. When you think about the SEC, you think about Georgia. But the running backs coach said that the Bulldogs aren't alone there. He said they are one of the most physical teams in it, but so are we. And that's why when you talk about Georgia, you can't blink without seeing Alabama. I love it. Gillespie went on to say this is a team that you respect. You respect their coaching staff. You respect their players. You respect the way they run their program. I think they have the same respect for us on this end. You're going to see two teams with a lot of respect. You have to go out and play a hard football game. I don't think they're going to be showing a lot of respect on the football field. Hey, man, good tackle. Hey, man, great play. Hey, you really got me on a 30-yard gain. Should be a slobber knocker on Saturday night. How about Georgia? Kirby Smart talking about his injury situation ahead of this one. Mykel Williams, star defensive end, been banged up. He said Mykel Williams, quote, it's going to be close in terms of being able to play against Bama. He said it was his first day out on the practice field, really getting out there and doing some things. He said he does feel good about defensive lineman Warren Brinson playing this week. Defensive lineman Jordan Hall, he said, is pushing through to try to practice. So sounds like Warren Brinson will play. Mykel Williams and Jordan Hall still question marks at this point. Now, David Pollack, he played at Georgia for many years. He knows all about this rivalry. He's the one that said the dreaded, Georgia is the king of college football or whatever it was, next to Nick Saban on the game day set a couple years ago, and then Bama beat Georgia. Anyway, he went on the Greg McElroy podcast and talked about this matchup, and he said, look, Georgia fans know that Alabama has had their number, and Georgia's going to be very interesting to me because their schedule sucks, and we talked about this all year long. The best team in the country, you can give me the best team last year, the last 10 years, are going to lose at least one game with this Georgia schedule. Now, if Georgia were to lose this game with Alabama, the ESPN FPI still has them as favorites in a lot of their games down the way. Pollack went on to say, if this is the one you choose to lose, look, you still got to play at Texas. You still play at Ole Miss. You still host Tennessee. I don't think Alabama's schedule by any means is easy, but compared to Georgia's, it's easier. Paul Feinbaum, on the other hand, he was on Get Up yesterday, and he was asked about this matchup and some pressure on Kalen DeBoer. Paul Feinbaum said, look, you don't get any honeymoons when you're the head coach at Alabama. He said, this game is massive for DeBoer, and some of it is because of perception. He said, going into the season, I thought Georgia would be a much bigger favorite. They didn't play great at Kentucky. Alabama has looked great, and DeBoer has had a seamless transition, which is almost inconceivable considering he replaced Nick Saban. But he's done almost everything right, and the Alabama fans know right now they cannot accept the fact that things have changed. They think they're still in charge of college football. He said, I don't want to tell them they're not. Texas is actually number one, but the real problem is a loss here would be a shock to the system. And Mondays after an Alabama loss are like nothing else because they happen so infrequently. So, yeah, it's right. I mean, I said this before the season. I said Kalen DeBoer might actually be a really good coach. He might be the perfect guy for Alabama. But Bama's schedule this year is tough, and they could lose 2 to 3 games. I just wonder, will the Alabama fans have patience for that? Meanwhile, College Game Day, they're going to give you some extra coverage from Tuscaloosa on Saturday. In addition to the normal College Game Day show, they will provide pregame and halftime coverage from Saban Field at Bryant-Denny Stadium. Reese Davis visited the Paul Feinbaum show to explain their expanded coverage. He said, Georgia, Alabama is going to be the centerpiece of game day. We will revisit it numerous times, but the charge and the mandate is still to cover the entire day of college football. So it won't be just Georgia, Alabama, but leading up to kickoff. But we will be on the field. It will be an Alabama-Georgia pregame show, and then we'll be there at halftime. So Nick Saban making his triumphant return back to Tuscaloosa as a part of the member of the College Game Day crew. All right, other tidbits we got to get to. Over at Tennessee, Colin Cowherd. Look, he says some crazy things from time to time, but he was doing a segment with Joel Klatt on Wednesday, and he made his pick for the winner of the college football playoff this year. He picked the Tennessee Volunteers. Here's what he said. He said, Tennessee is going to win the national championship. Tennessee's got the best defense of college football, an excellent coach, explosive on offense. I think Tennessee is the best team that I have seen. Joel Klatt told Cowherd he was wrong, but Cowherd's wrong in a lot of stuff. So I don't know if you're a Tennessee fan, if that's who you want championing you in your corner, Colin Cowherd. Especially, we're not even in October yet. He's picking to win a championship. It's early, folks. It's early. Over at Auburn, head coach Hugh Freeze asked about yesterday on the SEC teleconference about social media comments made by his former Ole Miss quarterback Bo Wallace. He said, quote, I'm not on social media. I have an account, but I don't have it on my phone. So I really don't know everything. By the way, that line in itself is hilarious, knowing why Hugh Freeze is no longer at Ole Miss. But I digress. Hugh Freeze went on to say, it's probably good that I don't. I did talk with Bo, and I love him so much. I wish nothing but the best for him. He's probably the most important recruit I ever had at Ole Miss. He's doing a good job coaching high school ball. I still love him like I always have. Backstory there is Bo Wallace took some shots at Hugh Freeze on social media over the weekend and kind of described him as not the best person. So Hugh Freeze did go on to say, he was asked about NIL, where if you missed it, the big story over at UNLV is their starting quarterback opting out and redshirting because of not getting payments on NIL. Hugh Freeze said, I think there are some folks who are really doing it well. If you look at folks like Ole Miss and Missouri, I think they've done some really good things trying to use NIL to their advantage, and they've been able to maintain a winning edge. Well, after that, we had to get Lane Kiffin's response to that. Lane Kiffin on the teleconference asked about Hugh Freeze complimenting his NIL collective. He said, quote, yeah, that's nice of him. Next, he'll try to steal Walker Jones like he's tried taking all of our coaches. Lane never shies away. Lane is like the new Spurrier, right? Like, you need somebody to make a spicy comment. It's Lane Kiffin. All right, back to football with Lane Kiffin. Asked about his matchup against Kentucky this weekend. He said, quote, huge challenge. Kentucky's absolutely loaded with players. They've always had a great scheme, coaching over there. Look at the Georgia game and how they played just 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, Mark Stoops asked about his team. He said, we're pleased with our continued needed improvement. First road game of the year. Very big challenge going on the road to play at Ole Miss. They're good in every phase. He was asked about Georgia's defense and the Ole Miss defense. He said they're both very long, very athletic, very multiple. Stoops also asked about Jackson Dart. He said, look, when he's uncomfortable, you see a tremendous presence. Jackson is completing 80% of his passes. That's remarkable. So he's making very good decisions. Only a couple of picks, 12 touchdowns. He's playing extremely well. Now, Ole Miss is going to host this game Saturday morning, and Matt Jones of Kentucky Sports Radio providing some bulletin board material for the Rebels. On his radio show yesterday, Matt Jones saying, quote, I will remind you, the home field advantage at Ole Miss is not that great, especially as a noon game. They roll out 11 a.m. local time. It's not even lunchtime yet. They're a late arriving crowd. It's a small stadium. It doesn't really get that loud, and usually the other team has a decent presence because people want to go to Oxford. So even though I think it's one of the best party places to go to in the SEC, As far as how hard it is to play, I would actually argue it's not that hard of a place to play, especially that early. I think you're getting them at the best time you can. I brought this up in the offseason when they announced the game time. I said that might work in Kentucky's favor. Because let's just be real. I mean, night games, I don't care where it is in the SEC. A night game is just a different atmosphere. That said, I don't know if it helps Kentucky tremendously. I think Ole Miss is awesome this year. We'll see how the game plays out. We'll make our picks later in the week. All right, over at Texas, Steve Sarkisian asked about Arch Manning, made his first career start. And on Wednesday, he said, look, I thought he responded very well. Look at a couple things. And the one thing you find out is when you're late on throws, especially over the middle, bad things can happen. I do think the way he responded to those interceptions, his ability to bounce back, play good football was really encouraging. Quinn Ewers still, quote, working his way back from that abdominal strain, but his status for this weekend's game is uncertain as they open SEC play at home against Mississippi State. Expect Quinn Ewers to, or rather Arch Manning to probably get the start again. Over at LSU, Brian Kelly, speaking on the SEC teleconference, was asked about, this day and age of the playoff. He said, just win, and everything else will take care of itself. Brian Kelly says things have changed in college football. Here was his quote. He said, he was asked if he considers style points because of the playoff. He said, I don't think so. So I think the depth of the SEC and conferences take precedent relative to your schedule. I don't know putting 70 points on someone does much anymore in the eyes of the committee. So interesting quotes there from Brian Kelly. One more note here, SEC basketball note, Kentucky Big Blue Madness. Obviously a big time showcase. It gets everybody ready for basketball season in Lexington, but it'll be a little bit more special this year. They're going to debut a new ASB glass floor. Rupp Arena will turn into a technological spectacle. I say that 10 times real fast. At the October 11th Big Blue Madness event, they will make history that night with the ASB glass floor. A global leader in innovative sports flooring will create the landmark spectacle. It'll be the first college basketball event that features the revolutionary floor, be a state-of-the-art court, a full LED video sports floor that will allow for interactive graphics and all kinds of other stuff. So be interesting to see. Like, is that a danger, though? Don't you want to play on the wooden floor? We'll play on glass? I guess. I mean, it'll look cool, graphics and stuff, but I'm sure they thought all that out. All right, more to come here on Locked On SEC, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. Coming up next, we're going to talk Graham Coffey. We'll preview the Georgia Bulldogs. That's coming your way in just a second. But first, today's episode presented to you by our friends over at FanDuel. And look, whether you're a college fan, NFL fan, you can start your season with a big return over at FanDuel. They are America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is over there at FanDuel, and they got plenty of action going on in the SEC this week. Of course, the big one is Georgia versus Alabama. Bama still sitting as a 2.5-point favorite. Folks, it has been a long time since Alabama has been a home underdog. I think you got to go back all the way to Saban's first year there at Alabama. But you like Bama plus the 2.5 to pull off the upset over Georgia and cover, you will get rewarded handsomely over there at FanDuel.com. Of course, some other games as well. LSU still only about 21.5 favorite over South Alabama. Remember, they didn't cover that big number against UCLA last week. So if you like South Alabama and Major Applewhite to keep it close with LSU, you can bet that as well. Check it out. It is over there at FanDuel, FanDuel.com, and on the FanDuel app, America's #1 sportsbook. Right along here, Locked On SEC, and look, we've been covering the biggest game of the season so far in the SEC happening this weekend. It's Georgia at Alabama. Yesterday's show, we got the Alabama perspective with our buddy Ryan Fowler. Today, we get the Georgia Bulldog perspective with our buddy Graham Coffey. Follow him on Twitter at GrahamCoffeyDC. Of course, DawgsCentral.com is where you can find his work. And Graham on the road, man, doing a little RVing, covering the dogs on a couple of road games here. And you're there in Athens, man. Give me the vibe. We did the vibe check in Tuscaloosa. What's the vibe like in Athens right now?
Yeah, you can feel like Monday, Tuesday, and now Wednesday, you can feel things starting to build up around town. There's just kind of that energy that is coming off of people and the excitement. It feels like a big game. Obviously, there's not quite the anticipation of, a big home game because Georgia's got to go over there to Tuscaloosa, but it is going to be very interesting, I think, to, see how they handle that road environment. And I think that Georgia fans are maybe as nervous about that as anybody at this point.
Yeah, it's weird too how one game can kind of set your mindset. But like 2 weeks ago, we see Alabama go into Wisconsin, get a big dominant win over Wisconsin, and then they go into their bye week and they're feeling all fat and happy. Georgia gets this ugly 1-point win at Kentucky where they very well could have lost it, but it's still a win. They're 3-0. But is that maybe part of why, like, everywhere I go, everybody's going Bama, Bama, Bama? Like, are we out on Georgia just simply because they had an ugly loss and that's the last time we saw them, or an ugly win rather, and we haven't seen them for 2 weeks?
I mean, yeah, it seems that way, right? And I think the bye week adds to that because it's an extra week to sit on things, and the sport is so week to week in terms of how opinions are made. And yeah, the last impression for Bama was really good. The last impression for Georgia was not so good. I think for Georgia, that Clemson game has kind of gotten forgotten. And I think it's also fair to look back at that game and say, okay, eventually they did win 34-3, but that first half was not the prettiest showing offensively. And you can look here and really say, like, Georgia's played 8 quarters against FBS opponents, and only 2 of those quarters have they really looked like an elite team or a great team offensively. And that, I think, is the reason why people have the opinions that they do. But you also go back and look at what Clemson has done since that game, and, holding that offense to 3 points looks more impressive by the week, right? What they did to NC State was, like, I mean, they were, that game was over in 10 minutes, literally, of game time. So I don't know that, the weighing of the Kentucky game and the Clemson game is maybe being done properly. I think people are kind of forgetting they held that Clemson offense to 188 total yards.
And when you become as dominant as Georgia's become these last 3 seasons under Kirby, it's like you're looking for any reason to start to go, oh, here's the crumbling. Oh, here's where they have now hit the wall and they're not as good. But Georgia's had games like this before. I've talked about it 2 years ago, fourth quarter game against Missouri, they needed to pull out. Last year at Auburn, it's a tied game late until Brock Bowers goes off. So Georgia's had these games where they play ugly, and then the next week they show up and look like dominant Georgia. So you can't really, I don't know, base that, close win at Kentucky of like, oh, that's who Georgia is this year.
Yeah, well, I mean, in 2022, they went to Kentucky. They scored 16 points. Our website was filled with threads about how, Stetson will always just be a walk-on and, those kind of things. And then 2 weeks later, they go and hang 50 on LSU in the SEC championship. And they led up in that game after about 3 quarters. So I don't know that one is predictive of the other. The only 3 times Georgia has been held under 20 points, I think, in the last 6 years now, were all on the road at Kentucky. They won all 3 of those games. It seems like Georgia uses that game for something. I have joked plenty of times in the past on my own show about, like, Kirby and Stoops. There's some sort of, like, black mirror that they stare into when they look at each other and see their souls counterpoints. And it's like, we're going to go out here, we're going to play football the way that, we really want it to be played. And it's just going to be defense and run game. And we're going to get out of here in about 2.5 hours because the clock's going to be moving the entire time. And, it's going to be ugly and disgusting. And people are going to have doubts about both afterwards. But I really do look back at the last few Georgia-Alabama matchups, aside from that national title that they won. It's been Alabama that comes into those games with all the questions. They came in 2021 after the double or maybe triple overtime win at Auburn against a bad Auburn team under Brian Harsin. And I think Bryce Young had been sacked like 6 or 7 times that game. And then last year they come in after the 4th and 31 for Milroe and same sort of questions. So maybe it helps Georgia this time to kind of and have 2 weeks to sit on all the people that do what we do, questioning them.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's very interesting to see. Again, the Vegas line has been sitting still as Georgia as the favorite, and again, I was just in Vegas. Those buildings are big and strong and tall, and there's a reason
Air
for that.
conditioning's cold, baby.
Let's talk a little health before we get into the actual matchup. Where is Georgia health wise? Let's start first with Tate Ratledge, who we know is injured and is going to miss some time. What's the plan here with the O-line and how they address that?
Yeah, I don't think we'll see Ratledge until at least the Florida game. Of everyone we might talk about here, he's the certainty that we won't see him. But I think they will just go with Mykel Morris. Mykel Morris and Dylan Fairchild basically were co-starters at left guard last year for Georgia. They rotated pretty equal snap counts. Both were very good players. Morris maybe a little better in the run, Fairchild a little better as a pass protector. We saw Morris come in and play right guard against Kentucky, and Georgia's offensive line struggled at times against Kentucky, but the middle three of that OL was really not the problem in that game. It was really the tackles that were tripping them up. So I don't think it's a huge concern. If they did decide to go to a third guard or rotate at guard at all, they do have a guy in Daniel Calhoun, who is a true freshman. He's been described to me as a moose, because he's just big and he's not sloppy and overweight and moves really well. So I think they're fine there. As far as concerns in this game for Georgia, offensive line is not really one that I would go to first off the bat.
Yeah, and this isn't I don't know. I don't want to disparage Alabama's defense because they're very good, and Kane Womack is a really good DC, and we'll see. But there's no Will Anderson Jr. There's no I'm looking to see who that guy is, and they've got Q
Right.
Robinson's got 3 sacks, but Tim Keenan's got a sack and a half. Justin Jefferson's got a sack, but it's not like I'm used to Alabama getting to this point. They got somebody with five sacks, somebody with 4.5 sacks. I don't know. Maybe they're just not as aggressive. Maybe they're a little bit more balanced. I don't know. But to your point with talking about the Georgia O-line, I don't know if there's an Alabama defender that I'm like, well, they better double team that guy.
Yeah, I think, Quay Russaw, I remember covering him as a recruit, and he's got the stuff from a physical standpoint. It's just, Georgia, Alabama is a really hard game to look at and say, this is where a young player at any position is going to break out. I do think Georgia at the tackle position, to be fair, it's not like Kentucky had a bunch of stud edge rushers either. So if they play the way that they did against Kentucky, then I don't know it matters that Alabama doesn't have that star that you were talking about. But I'll be watching Xavier Truss really closely at tackle for Georgia. He was the guy that came in last year against Bama when Amarius Mims got hurt. And it really kind of seemed like he struggled with those high-end, future NFL edge rushers that Alabama had 2 of last year. And I'm curious if that kind of drop-off that you're talking about in talent maybe allows him to all of a sudden become, a safe type of player for Georgia in a game like this where he wasn't before. And I think it affected Georgia's play calling and how willing they were to let Carson Beck just drop back and pass it.
Yeah, and to your point on Russaw, he's a guy that sounds like he should go this week. So we'll see on that front. Malachi Moore, I know it sounds like he may be back. What about for Georgia, Mykel Williams? I know Kirby was kind of, I don't know, his verbiage was interesting this week. You never get a read on, is he going to play or not?
I'm going to be honest with you, man. I'm not trying to play into what Kirby's doing or anything like that, but I don't know. On Monday, I talked to a source that has been, very good on injury info for a long time. And their answer was, I don't think he's going to play. And then I talked to that same source yesterday and they said, I think there's an 80% chance he plays. So it really seems like day to day at practice, they're sort of seeing different things from him. I know that, yesterday at practice, it didn't seem like he showed a visible limp and did more than anyone has seen him do in a while. I'm not sure that he's, in every drill or they're, throwing him out there for everything. But I think for me, the way that I'm starting to look at that Mykel situation is if they have him, great, but they probably should plan to win this game without him, because they might have to.
Yeah, or maybe if he does play, like maybe only third downs, just bring him in on obvious.
That would be the move, I would think. Yeah, for sure.
All right, more with Graham Coffey here of Dawgs Central. Just a second. More with Graham Coffey here in just a second. But first, I want to remind you guys, today's episode presented to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. It is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And all you got to do is pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you will watch the winnings roll in. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. And Prize Picks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy so that your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, Prize Picks, your picks are still live. Prize Picks invented the flex play as well, which means you could still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You could double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. You just got to go download the Prize Picks app. Do that today and use our code LOCKEDONCollege. Get $50 off instantly when you play $5. That's LOCKEDONCollege on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you bet $5. You can even you don't even need to receive the $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. Prize Picks, go run your game. All right, continue our conversation with Graham Coffey, who is previewing the game of the century. It's Alabama hosting
game
Georgia.
Of the century, of the week, of the year.
I mean, it's crazy. This was the game we had circled all summer, and it's like, both camps, Georgia and Bama, you've been counting down the days to this game. Georgia fans, like, when I talked to them in the summer, they didn't even talk about the Clemson game. Like, they're like, we're going to beat Clemson. We're not worried about that one. So,
absolutely. Yeah, it's been the vibe from the start.
Let's talk about this angle, Graham, because this has been the big topic of the week. Is Bama's looked awesome and they've been impressive. But all this talk about what Bama has done to Georgia in recent years, my question always comes back to how much of that is Bama and how much of that is Saban? And with Saban gone, what is this Alabama team? And this is obviously a big spot for Kalen DeBoer, who's been a very good coach the last few years. Good job at Fresno, great job at Washington, but he's still very green. And we don't know if he is a SEC caliber coach yet until he coaches a big SEC game. And this is a big test for him. He's got a lot of advantages. He's at home, but give me a thought kind of on life post Saban, Georgia taking on Kalen DeBoer's Bama, not Nick Saban's.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Kirby Smart, having a Nick Saban problem, everyone had a Nick Saban problem in college football, right? Like, being 1-5 against Nick Saban is endlessly forgivable on a certain level. Having a Nick Saban problem and having a Alabama problem are two entirely different things. And I think Georgia wants to prove on Saturday that they had a Nick Saban problem and they don't have an Alabama problem. Because if they have an Alabama problem, I think that the implications that might have on the recruiting trail and on kind of, Georgia's chances of maybe replacing Alabama as a long-term dynasty, which they're on the way to doing with what they did in 21 and 2022. That's immediately threatened, I think, if they lose this game on Saturday. Now, with this 12-team playoff, this game, really is not going to make or break either of these teams' seasons, but it is certainly going to affect how we talk about these coaches, how we talk about these programs, how they recruit, how prospects look at them. Like the ripple effect from a perception standpoint from this game is, I think, as big as you could really hope for a regular season game in this new expanded playoff era.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, if it could be a close game that Georgia pulls out late, and still yet on Monday morning, Paul Feinbaum will be loaded with callers about DeBoer ain't cut out for the Bama job. There will be a overreaction on both sides, and it could be both these teams are awesome and probably going to both make the playoff, but there will be overreaction to who loses it. But also, to your point, there's little room for error. Like, Georgia's still got a tough road ahead. Bama's still got a tough road ahead. So you lose this game, and it's really like, hey, we really can't afford much room for error down the stretch.
Yeah, for sure. And I think for Georgia, with that schedule that's ahead, this game on some level is going to probably impact how you feel about the two big road games that you're going to have with Texas and Ole Miss. So it's like, even if they could win this one, I think that, privately, if you gave Kirby Smart true serum, take all that perception stuff out of it. I think they would prefer to win this one just because it will kind of, I think, always like let them feel good about where they got to go after this. But I don't know. I mean, with all of this, I think the way that we've talked about this game, if this was Georgia and Texas being played right now, but, we put Texas uniforms on Alabama's players, I think we would probably be talking about this game a little bit differently. But because it's Georgia and Alabama, and because we've seen Alabama play that spoiler kind of foil for Georgia so many times in the last, decade now, it really does seem like people are kind of assuming that Alabama is going to continue to be Alabama because there's still a script A on those crimson helmets.
There's a few things here, and just, I'll just kind of get your general thoughts on how you think this one will play out. I do think Mike Bobo can't be conservative. I think you're going to have to throw the ball. You're going to have to make plays. I wonder how good Bama's secondary is. There's been some question marks still on how good they really are. On the flip side, those Bama receivers, I mean, Ryan Williams has been awesome. He's 17, but he acts like he's 25. Like, he's really good. And I think Georgia's DBs haven't really been tested yet. The question marks about, okay, Dalen Everett and these guys like Julian Humphrey, are they ready for the prime time? This is going to be a big one for them. But, I mean, we know you're going to have to score points to win this one. I don't think you can win it playing it in a phone booth, but how do you see this one playing out kind of on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Georgia's offense, the question that I have, and I think probably Georgia fans everywhere have, kind of relates back to what we were talking about with Kentucky and kind of the pattern that Georgia has around Kentucky and how they play that game. Like, was that the Georgia offense, or are we going to see the Georgia offense on Saturday? Because Kirby Smart for a long time has kind of, had this long con sort of philosophy with how he runs a season. And I mean, 2022 Tennessee was a perfect example of a game where a lot of people thought, Georgia's offense isn't going to really be able to keep up, and they were able to. So I'm curious. I have a lot of unknowns in this game, more than it feels like we should, maybe, after seeing both these teams play 3 times. But yeah, the Bama secondary, you turn on game tape, and if you find all 22 tape of their defense, like, you see Western Kentucky wide receivers like open down the seams, and you see guys in a lot of places that could be explosive plays. They haven't faced a quarterback who was really good enough to see that or deliver those balls yet. So is that Carson Beck on Saturday night? Maybe. But Georgia's wide receivers, I think, have equal amounts of questions. No Brock Bowers, no Ladd McConkey. Dominic Lovett, I think, had probably his best game at Georgia, in my opinion, against Kentucky, and really stepped up in some clutch moments when they needed him. I think that's a matchup Georgia is going to like and needs to take advantage of, is him against the Bama slot corners. But Dylan Bell on the outside, he's done some nice things in his career. I think he's struggled to create separation at times against better, more athletic corners. Can he create separation in this game? Is Colby Young going to be a big part of this game plan? He's looked good when we've seen him. We haven't seen him that much. I think we've all sort of speculated, is that hamstring injury from fall camp lingering a little bit? So yeah, you start going down the line, and Arian Smith looked good against Clemson and had some intermediate kind of catches for the first time in his career, really. But is he ready to go be a feature receiver in this type of game? And, it's now or never for him. He's a 5th-year senior. He's stuck it out. There were times everybody thought he would transfer. He has gone from being a track guy who happened to play wide receiver to now looking more like a wide receiver who happens to have track speed. But does it all come to fruition on Saturday? So that is the matchup for me that I have the most questions about, is really Georgia's receivers versus Bama's secondary. I think, flipping over to the other side of the ball, I understand sort of the questions about those corners, but I'll just tell you from seeing them up close in person against Kentucky, Kentucky's got great athletes at wide receiver, and those guys can run and get deep, and Georgia looked really comfortable on the back end against UK. What I think Georgia should be concerned about, and I know they are concerned about, is what happens when Milroe escapes the pocket? What happens when your corners have to cover for 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds? That's really hard to do for anybody. And I think Georgia better have their scramble rules down pat within their secondary on Saturday night when they come into this game, because I do think Georgia's defense should be able to manage the Bama passing game pretty well within those first 4 to 5 seconds of a play. It's what happens afterwards where they need to really watch their back.
You got a prediction?
Oh man,
I'll have to give one.
I'm leaning towards Georgia winning this game. The more this week goes on, the more that I kind of can gather morsels from around the program, the more that I feel like we haven't really seen the entire offense yet, and that they're going to have some things in the run game up their sleeve that, will maybe be new and a little less vanilla than just running inside zone like every other play, which is what they've kind of done so far this year. So yeah, I think that they get this done. I'll be honest with you. I do think there is a scenario where we come out of Saturday night and all of a sudden we're talking about Carson Beck the way that a lot of people were a month ago, because I think that Bama's corners are as bad as any Bama corners that I've seen since at least 2007. And so, if Georgia's wide receivers are able to step up, I think Carson Beck is able to, do what he needs to do. And we could see him kind of have a similar type of game to what Quinn Ewers had in Tuscaloosa early last season.
He is Graham Coffey, Dawgs Central, dogscentral.com. Best place for people to check out your stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Dawgs Central, anything and everywhere. You can YouTube, podcast, all that stuff. Just type in Dawgs Central and it'll somehow loop back to me in the end.
And he'll be RVing and having you covered all the Georgia road games the next couple of weeks. So have full coverage there.
People are saying Graham Coffey and Donald Trump are both coming to Tuscaloosa on Saturday night.
That's what I've heard. That's what everybody is talking about on all the big news services. Graham, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on.
All right, that's Graham Coffey here on Locked On SEC. Thank you guys so much for making us your first listen every day. Now you can make your second listen. Check out Locked On College Football with Spencer McLaughlin, and he'll get you covered with all the biggest sports stories throughout the rest of the world of college football. But for Graham Coffey, I'm Chris Gordon. This has been Locked On SEC. Come on back tomorrow and see us. We'll have you fully covered with all things Southeastern Conference.